I don't care what excuse you have, Officer Williams growled, his words echoing through the quiet park. His breath was heavy, his eyes narrowing with disdain. The elderly woman, bent over in a long coat, slowly straightened up. A few strays gathered around her, looking up at her as if waiting for the next morsel. Eleanor Turner had no intention of backing down. She wasn't afraid of this man, not because he was a cop, but because she had seen worse in her time. With a steady gaze, she met his glare. "Excuse me, sir," she asked, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension in the air. "What did you say?" Officer Williams took a step forward, crossing the line between authority and arrogance. "You're disturbing the peace. You can't just sit here feeding these damn cats. Move along." Eleanor stood her ground, not moving an inch. She could feel the eyes of the people around her, some watching in silence, others quietly muttering. The young officer's frustration grew with each passing second. His power, though momentary, was everything to him. "You really don't understand, do you?" Eleanor's voice was low, but the words hung in the air. "This is a public space, and I have every right to be here." He sneered. "You don't even belong here. You're just a old woman who should be at home, not making trouble." For a brief moment, Eleanor's thoughts flashed back to her years on the bench, her days of making decisions that impacted lives. She had stood in courts, faced down the most powerful figures in the country, and yet here she was, treated like nothing more than a nuisance for feeding stray cats. She shook off the momentary surge of emotion. The crowd around her had grown quieter, sensing the conflict. People usually didn't want to get involved, especially when a uniform was involved. But there was something different in the way Eleanor stood there. She wasn't scared. She wasn't backing down. The officer's patience was running thin. He stepped closer, now looming over her. "You're just a retired judge. That's all. You have no power here." Eleanor's expression remained neutral, her face giving away nothing. She didn't react to his taunt. Instead, she simply reached into her pocket and pulled out her ID. She handed it to him slowly, almost casually. "You may want to take another." "Look," she said, her words so measured, so deliberate, that they felt like a strike of a gavel. Officer Williams hesitated, his eyes flicking down to the card in his hand. The name on it was familiar, but it took a second for the realization to settle in. Eleanor Turner, retired federal judge. His eyes widened, and for a split second, he lost his composure. He looked up at her, disbelief written all over his face. He stuttered, I didn't know." Eleanor didn't flinch. "No one does," she replied quietly, watching the officer's face turn pale. He stood there, holding her ID, staring at her in silence. The crowd around them had begun to murmur, some people nodding in realization, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The officer had just tried to throw a retired judge out of a public park for feeding stray cats, and now, he was unsure how to respond. Eleanor took a slow step forward, her heels clicking lightly on the pavement. "You may wear a badge, but your badge doesn't make you above the law," she said. "I've spent my life making sure people like you don't abuse their power." The words hit him like a slap, even though they were delivered without a hint of anger. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence between them stretched longer than it should have. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he muttered, "I'm sorry." Eleanor nodded, folding her hands in front of her. "I suggest you take your apology and your lesson with you," she said coolly, turning away from him and back to the cats. She sat down on the park bench, ignoring the officer, who stood there still holding her ID. She felt no need for further explanation. The crowd slowly began to disperse, some still watching the officer in disbelief, others walking away with a quiet respect for the woman who had just turned the tables on a cop. Eleanor smiled faintly as the cats mewed at her, nudging her for more food. The world around her had shifted, but she had not. She was the same Eleanor Turner who had once ruled the courtroom, and today, she had shown just how powerful quiet strength could be. I was already halfway across the park when the officer finally found his voice again. I'm sorry, ma'am," he muttered, the words barely escaping his lips as if he were testing them for the first time. Eleanor didn't turn around. Her hands were still buried in her coat pockets, her head slightly lowered as she walked away, but the silent apology hung in the air like a fog, thick and heavy. The officer's words seemed out of place, misplaced even, as if he had realized the magnitude of his mistake too late. Eleanor didn't need his apology. In fact, she had never been one to wait for apologies from anyone. She had long ago learned that real change didn't come from apologies, it came from actions. The sound of Officer Williams' boots clinking against the concrete behind her was enough to tell her he was still standing there, unsure of what to do next. Eleanor could almost feel his discomfort, the hesitation radiating from him in waves. She took a deep breath, slowing her pace just enough to let him catch up. He fell in step beside her, not speaking but clearly struggling to process the situation. They reached the edge of the park, where the scattered remains of an autumn afternoon lay, leaves turning yellow, trees emptying themselves of their summer green. Eleanor stopped at a bench, the one she always sat on when she came here in the mornings. She let her fingers trace the worn wood beneath her, the familiar surface grounding her thoughts. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" she asked, her voice low, almost to herself. The officer stiffened, a half-step back. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. She glanced over at him, her eyes sharp. "You think you can treat me like just another old woman," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "Like I'm just another forgotten face in the crowd. You think because I don't wear a uniform or carry a badge, that means I'm powerless. That's the mistake you made." Officer Williams stood still for a moment, as if the weight of her words had just landed. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally shook his head. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't thinking," he stammered, his usual confidence crumbling under the weight of her experience. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her gaze never leaving his. "That's the problem," she said. "You never think. You just act, without realizing who you're hurting or why you're doing it." She paused, watching a young couple walk by with their dog, the sunlight filtering through the trees casting long shadows on the ground. "You see, I've spent a lifetime thinking," she continued, her voice softer now, but still firm. "And I learned something early on. Respect is not something you can demand. It's something you earn." The officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the ground, then back to her. Eleanor could see he was struggling to come to terms with what had just happened. He wasn't accustomed to people speaking to him like this. He wasn't accustomed to being wrong, especially not in front of a crowd. "I'm sorry," he said again, this time with a little more conviction. Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes softened, but her stance remained strong. "I know you are," she said. "But being sorry doesn't change anything. It's what you do next that matters." She stood up from the bench, smoothing the fabric of her coat. "I've fought battles in courtrooms where the stakes were far higher than this," she said, "where the men I stood against had much more power than you do. But I never let them forget who I was. And I won, because I never backed down." She began to walk away, leaving the officer behind, still standing by the bench. He watched her for a moment, his mind racing with the realization that he had just encountered someone far more powerful than he could have imagined. Eleanor was not a woman to be underestimated, not because of her age, her appearance, or her quiet demeanor, but because of the strength she carried within her. It wasn't in her words, nor in her actions. It was in the life she had lived, the battles she had fought, and the wisdom she had earned. And as Eleanor disappeared into the fading sunlight, Officer Williams stood there, a man who would never look at another person the same way again. He had learned that respect was something earned, not demanded, and Eleanor Turner had taught him that lesson without lifting a finger. I watched as Officer Williams stood there, his mind clearly racing, yet still uncertain of how to process the exchange. It was as if the world around him had slowed, and he was left standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to step back or forward. His hand tightened around his baton as he tried to muster the words that might make sense of the situation. But there was nothing he could say. Eleanor Turner had walked away from him, and with each step she took, the grip of his authority loosened. He could feel the weight of her presence long after she had gone. The park seemed quieter, more still, as if the trees themselves were waiting for him to make sense of it all. As Eleanor continued her walk down the path, the autumn wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the scent of the changing season. The leaves crunched beneath her feet, a comforting sound, one that reminded her of simpler times, of peaceful moments spent in her own company. But she was not one to dwell in the past. She had lived through the battles, the fights, and the challenges that life had thrown her way. And now, in this moment, she was living through a different kind of challenge. one that involved a young officer who thought he understood power but had yet to grasp its true meaning. Eleanor stopped at the park's edge and looked out at the small lake that sat quietly beneath the gray sky. The water was calm, undisturbed by any outside forces, much like how she had always tried to live her life. She found peace in the stillness. Her fingers brushed the edges of the bench as she sat, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Behind her, the sound of footsteps approached. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She could feel the presence of Officer Williams drawing near. He stopped a few feet away, unsure if he was welcome to approach, but his hesitation was evident. Eleanor didn't rush him. Instead, she let the silence settle between them, a space for reflection, for understanding. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost apologetic. "I've been thinking," he began, taking a tentative step closer. Eleanor turned her head slightly, her eyes never leaving the lake. "About what you said," he continued. "I didn't realize. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean to disrespect you." Eleanor's gaze remained fixed ahead, her posture calm but alert. She didn't need his apology, but she understood why he had come to find her. There was a lesson here, one that he needed to learn. "You've been taught to respect authority, haven't you?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience. To follow orders without question, without thought. Officer Williams stood still, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to this kind of conversation, not one that forced him to look inward. But there was something about Eleanor, about the way she carried herself, that made him want to understand. "I've seen people like you before," she said, her voice steady but full of depth. "People who think power comes from a uniform, from a badge, from a gun. But it doesn't. Power comes from how you treat others, how you stand in the face of adversity." Officer Williams shifted uncomfortably, his thoughts swirling. He had never considered this. In all his training, in all the hours spent learning how to command respect, no one had ever told him that true power was earned through kindness, through humility. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor finally turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with quiet resolve. "The first step is realizing that you don't have all the answers. The second step is learning to listen." She stood up, brushing off the dirt from her coat. "And the third step," she added, "is to never forget who you are, no matter what role you're in." Officer Williams nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the ground as he processed her words. For the first time, he felt as though he were being seen, not as a figure of authority, but as a person. Eleanor's presence had shattered something inside him, something he hadn't realized needed to be broken. She didn't need to explain herself to him, and yet, in a few simple words, she had opened his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. Eleanor smiled faintly, her expression warm but knowing. "It's not me you should thank," she said. "It's the people you serve, the ones who never get the chance to speak up. They're the ones who teach you what really matters." With that, Eleanor turned and began walking away again, leaving Officer Williams standing there, still processing the lesson she had given him. He watched her disappear into the distance, a new understanding beginning to form within him. He wasn't just a cop. He was a man who could change, who could grow. And that realization, that spark of possibility, made all the difference. I never expected to see him again. The city had a way of swallowing people up, erasing them from memory like forgotten names on a dusty list. Yet, there he was, standing in front of the small cafe Eleanor frequented in the mornings. Officer Williams, his uniform as sharp as ever, but there was something different in his demeanor. He wasn't the man she had encountered that day in the park. His posture was straighter, his expression more thoughtful, and his gaze, now steady, held a kind of humility she hadn't seen before. Eleanor paused for a moment, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup, the warm steam rising to meet her face. It had been a week since their last encounter, and she had nearly convinced herself that it had been a fleeting moment, a lesson learned and then forgotten. But seeing him here, in this place, felt like something more. He stepped toward her slowly, almost cautiously, as if unsure of what to say or how to approach. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer than the commanding tone she had heard that day. I wanted to thank you for what you said." Eleanor looked up at him, raising an eyebrow. "Thank me?" she asked, her voice calm, but with a hint of curiosity. "Yes," he continued, taking a seat at the table across from her. "I've been thinking about what you said ever since. About power, about respect, and about how easy it is to forget that there's more to life than the badge. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I've been doing this job for years, and I never really understood what it meant to serve until I met you. Eleanor studied him for a moment. Her eyes narrowed, but not in judgment, more in quiet recognition. She could see it now, the shift in him. It was subtle, but it was there. Officer Williams had taken the first step toward understanding something that few ever bothered to learn. I've been trying to make sense of it, he continued, his voice almost a whisper now. And I realize that I've been wrong. I've been so focused on enforcing rules, on making people follow orders, that I forgot to listen. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her fingers gently tapping the side of her cup. That's the problem, she said quietly. People like you, people in positions of power, are so often blinded by their own sense of authority that they forget what it means to truly lead. He nodded, his eyes downcast, as if her words had unlocked something within him. It's not about controlling others, Eleanor went on, her voice steady. It's about knowing when to step back, when to listen, and when to act with empathy. He looked up at her then, his eyes wide with realization. I never thought about it like that, he admitted. I always thought being in charge meant having all the answers. But I see now that the best leaders are the ones who don't pretend to know everything, the ones who are willing to learn and grow. Eleanor nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It's a hard lesson to learn, she said, but it's one that lasts a lifetime. Officer Williams sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words settling in. He had come to her today not just to apologize, but to understand. And in doing so, he had taken the first real step toward becoming the kind of person he had always hoped to be. Someone who truly understood the meaning of service, of leadership, and of respect. Finally, he spoke again, his voice filled with a newfound conviction. I want to make it right, he said. I want to do more than just wear the uniform. I want to earn the trust of the people I serve. Eleanor studied him, her expression softening. That's a start, she said quietly. But remember this. Earning trust is not a one-time thing. It's something you build, every day, with every person you meet. Officer Williams smiled, his gaze steady now. I understand, he said, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. Eleanor took another sip of her coffee, her eyes meeting his. Good, she said, a faint smile crossing her face. Now go and make a difference. As Officer Williams stood up to leave, he looked back at her one last time, his eyes filled with gratitude. He had come here searching for answers, and in doing so, he had found something even more valuable, a new understanding of what it truly meant to be a person of integrity, someone who could serve not just with power, but with humility. Eleanor watched him walk out of the cafe, her heart quiet, knowing that this was only the beginning of his journey. And as the door closed behind him, she felt the weight of the lesson settle in her own chest. The world was full of people who thought they knew everything, but it was the ones who were willing to listen, to learn, and to grow who would truly make a difference. I saw Officer Williams again the following week. It was a chilly morning, and Eleanor had just finished her routine walk through the park, her hands buried deep in her pockets as she moved toward the bench by the lake. The air was crisp, and the golden hues of the early sun were just beginning to warm the ground. As she sat down, her thoughts wandered back to the conversation she had shared with him, the sincerity in his voice still fresh in her mind. She wasn't sure what had changed in him, but it was clear that something had. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon. Yet here he was, walking towards her with a hesitant smile, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He looked different somehow, more grounded, less sure of the rigid confidence he had worn before. He stopped a few feet away, pausing just out of her reach. Morning, he said, his voice steady but with an undertone of uncertainty. Eleanor studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before she nodded. Morning, she replied simply, not pressing him for any further words. She could tell he had something on his mind. He sat down beside her, the space between them comfortable but filled with an unspoken understanding. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he began, his tone softer than before. I started talking to the people I work with, you know, the ones I see every day, and they've been telling me things I never even realized. Eleanor turned her head slightly to face him, her eyes curious but not expectant. She had no need to push him for answers. She knew he would speak when he was ready. They're right, He continued after a moment, his gaze on the ground as he spoke. I never really saw them, not the way I should. I've been so caught up in what I thought was important, the rules, the orders, that I forgot to see the people I'm supposed to protect. Eleanor listened, her gaze focused on the soft ripples in the lake. She had heard these kinds of words before, from people who were beginning to understand something they had once overlooked. It was always a powerful moment when someone realized the true weight of their role. I've been talking to some of the folks in the neighborhood too, he added, his voice gaining more confidence. People who live on the other side of the badge. And it's a different world over there. A world I've never fully understood. Eleanor nodded, her hands folded on her lap. It's a different world for everyone, she said quietly. But it's not enough to just see it. You have to live it. You have to walk in their shoes, feel the weight of their struggles, before you can truly understand. I want to help, he said, his voice earnest now, without hesitation. I don't want to just wear the badge anymore. I want to do something that actually matters. I want to make things right. Eleanor turned to look at him, studying his face for a moment. She could see the determination in his eyes, the shift that had taken place within him. He wasn't the same man who had stood in the park a week ago, ready to dismiss her with a glance. He was someone else now, someone who understood that real change required more than just words. You've taken the first step, she said softly. But you're not done yet. The real work is in the day-to-day, in the small moments where you make the choice to listen, to act with respect, and to be the kind of person who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard. He nodded, the weight of her words settling in. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them as they both sat in the quiet of the park. The world was moving around them, but in this moment, it was just the two of them, one learning, the other watching, waiting to see if he would take the next step. Finally, Officer Williams stood up, his shoulders squared, a new resolve in his posture. I'm going to keep learning, he said, his voice firm. I'm going to do better. I promise. Eleanor watched him, a faint smile touching her lips. I believe you, she said simply, watching as he turned to leave, his steps more confident now. She sat there for a while longer, the stillness of the park calming her, grounding her thoughts. The world outside of this moment was full of noise and distractions, but here, in this quiet space, Eleanor knew that real change could begin. And maybe, just maybe, it had started with a single conversation, a lesson learned, and a promise made. Officer Williams had walked away with a sense of purpose, but Eleanor remained seated, content in the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful things in life happened quietly, without fanfare. It wasn't about grand gestures or loud actions. It was about making the choice to be better, to do better, every single day. I never expected to see him again so soon. Officer Williams, the man who had once been so sure of his position, now seemed like a different person. Eleanor sat on the park bench, the sunlight filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The world around her felt still, calm, and the air carried the scent of fresh grass. It was a peaceful moment, one she cherished in the midst of the chaos that often surrounded her. But today, as she sat quietly, the sound of footsteps disrupted the serenity. She looked up and saw him. He was walking toward her, his hands in his pockets, his gaze downcast. He looked like he had been carrying a heavy burden, something weighing on him that he had yet to put down. She didn't need to speak to know why he was here. He had come to finish what they had started the other day, to take the next step. Ma'am, he said, his voice softer than she remembered. I wanted to thank you again. For everything. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She simply studied him, her eyes sharp but calm. She could see the sincerity in his posture, the way he held himself now. He wasn't the same man who had stood in front of her in the park that day. He had changed, and that change was visible in every part of him. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he continued, his voice steady now. And I know I've still got a long way to go. But I want to make things right. I want to be the kind of person who stands for more than just the badge. Eleanor nodded slightly, allowing him to speak without interruption. She had no need to rush him. He had come to her, seeking guidance, seeking change, and she knew that the journey he was on wouldn't happen overnight. I've been going out into the community more, he said, his voice becoming more confident as he spoke. I've been talking to people, listening to them, and it's been eye-opening. I never realized how much I was missing, how much I had been blind to. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her gaze still fixed on him. "And what have you learned?" she asked, her voice quiet. But there was a note of encouragement in it. He looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts before answering. "I've learned that there's so much more to a person than what's on the surface. That people are more than just their circumstances, more than just the role they play. I've learned that power isn't about control. It's about respect, and it's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, no matter who they are." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "That's a good start," she said, her voice filled with quiet approval. "But remember, it's not enough to just understand it. You have to live it every single day." "I know," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'm ready to start living it." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves around them, as if the world itself was giving him its approval. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands resting gently on her lap. She had seen this before. People realizing their mistakes, wanting to change, wanting to do better. But the real question was always the same. Would they follow through? Would they take the lessons they had learned and apply them when it mattered most? "It's going to be hard," she said, breaking the silence. "There will be moments when you're tempted to slip back into old habits, when it's easier to just go along with what's comfortable. But you can't. You have to keep pushing forward, even when it's difficult." "I will," he replied firmly, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that left no doubt. "I promise." Eleanor nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "Good," she said simply. "Now, go and show the world who you really are." As Officer Williams stood up and turned to leave, Eleanor watched him walk away. She could see the determination in his step, the weight of the promise he had made to himself and to the people he served. He wasn't the same man who had stood before her a week ago, unsure of his place in the world. He was someone else now, a man who had learned a lesson and who was ready to act on it. Eleanor smiled softly to herself as she watched him disappear into the distance. There was still much to be done, but she knew that today, a small step had been taken. A step that could lead to something greater, something that would make a real difference. The world was full of people who had the potential to change, but it was the ones who were willing to learn, to grow, and to be better that would leave a lasting impact. And in that moment, Eleanor knew that Officer Williams was one of them. I had never seen Officer Williams quite like this before. The last few weeks had changed him in ways that were hard to describe. But there he was, standing at the edge of the park, looking at the world with a new set of eyes. Eleanor knew he had come a long way since the first time they met. The arrogance, the impatience, those traits were no longer as obvious in him. What replaced them was a quiet determination, a resolve to do better, to be better. It was a cold afternoon, the kind where the air bit at your skin, but the sun still managed to shine through the bare branches of the trees. Eleanor sat at her usual spot, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, the steam rising gently toward the sky. The leaves crunched beneath the soles of her boots as she looked up and saw him walking toward her. He was dressed casually today, no uniform, just a jacket and jeans, the weight of his job no longer worn so visibly. "Ma'am," he greeted her with a nod, a small but sincere smile on his face. "Mind if I sit?" Eleanor glanced at the empty bench beside her and motioned for him to take a seat. "It's a free world," she said lightly. He chuckled, sitting down beside her, his posture more relaxed than the rigid stance he once held. "I've been thinking," he began, his eyes focused on the horizon. "About what you said, about leadership, about respect, about how much I didn't understand before." Eleanor nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I'm starting to see things differently," he said, his voice quiet but filled with purpose. "I realized I was just going through the motions, doing my job without really seeing the people around me. I thought I was serving, but I was really just enforcing rules." Eleanor glanced over at him, her eyes thoughtful. "There's a big difference between serving and enforcing," she said. "Anyone can follow orders. But a true leader knows when to listen, when to step back, and when to show empathy." He nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "I've started going out of my way to talk to people," he continued. "The ones I used to ignore, the ones I thought didn't matter. And it's been eye-opening. I've had some tough conversations, but I've also learned so much." Eleanor's gaze softened, a faint smile on her lips. "Good," she said simply. "But it's not just about learning, officer. It's about changing. It's about what you do with that knowledge, how you act on it when it matters most." He looked over at her, his eyes steady. I want to change, he said. I'm committed to making it right. I don't want to just wear the uniform. I want to be someone people can trust. Someone who doesn't just talk about justice, but lives it. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her fingers gently tapping the side of her coffee cup. She had heard many people speak with similar intentions, but the key was always the same: follow through. She had to believe he would do what he said, but it wasn't easy. Change doesn't happen overnight, she said softly. It's a daily commitment, a choice you make every single day. And the world won't always make it easy for you. But it's the people you serve who need you to keep going, even when it gets hard. He looked down for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I'm ready for it, he said. I know I can't change everything, but I want to be part of the solution, not just the problem. Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile that came from years of knowing exactly what people were capable of, even when they didn't know it themselves. You're on the right path, she said. But remember, humility is key. Never forget where you came from and who you're fighting for. They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves the only noise between them. It was peaceful, this quiet understanding between them, as if they had both reached a point where words no longer needed to fill the space. Officer Williams took a deep breath, his gaze turning back to the path that stretched ahead. I'll do my best, he said quietly. Thank you, Eleanor, for everything. Eleanor nodded, watching him stand up and walk away, a sense of peace settling over her. She had given him the tools to see the world differently, and now, it was up to him to use them. He wasn't the same man he had been, but the journey was far from over. As the wind picked up and the sun dipped lower in the sky, Eleanor remained on the bench, content. There was no need for grand gestures. Sometimes, the real change happened in the quiet moments, when no one was watching, and all that mattered was the promise to be better, day by day. I was walking through the park again, the air sharp with the cold of early winter, when I saw him. Officer Williams. He wasn't in his usual uniform, just dressed in a casual jacket and jeans, but somehow, he stood out just the same. There was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself now, a steadiness in his step that hadn't been there before. He had changed, in ways that couldn't be ignored. The last few weeks had been a turning point for him, and the signs were clear. He didn't notice me at first as he walked down the path toward the bench where I sat, but I had noticed him. He looked different. His face wasn't as tense, his shoulders weren't as stiff. It was as though the burden he had been carrying had started to lift, just a little. When he finally did spot me, his expression softened, and for the first time, I saw genuine respect in his eyes. Eleanor, he said, his voice calm. But there was a warmth there that hadn't been present in our earlier encounters. Mind if I sit? I gestured toward the empty space beside me, giving him a simple nod. He sat down without hesitation, but the air between us was different now. There was no tension, no need to prove anything. Just two people, sitting together in silence, as if the world around us had fallen away. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he said, breaking the silence after a few moments. His tone was steady, but I could hear the weight in it. About everything you've told me. About the way I've been, living my life. I turned to look at him, giving him the space to speak freely. I've spent so much time focusing on my job, on the badge, he continued, his eyes cast down. But I've come to realize that I've been doing it all wrong. I've been hiding behind my authority, thinking that's what makes me who I am. But it's not. It never was. I said nothing, simply waiting for him to continue. He needed to speak, and I wasn't going to interrupt him. I've been out in the community more, he said, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Talking to people, listening to them. And for the first time, I feel like I'm actually doing something that matters. Not just carrying out orders, but truly connecting with people. I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us for a moment. This was the officer Williams the first had hoped to see. The one who wasn't afraid to admit his mistakes, to learn, to grow. It's not easy, he added, his voice quieter now, as if the admission was still difficult for him. But I'm trying. I know it's going to take time, but I want to be better. I want to be someone people can trust. Not because of the uniform I wear, but because of who I am. I looked at him closely, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. This wasn't the man who had shown up in front of me in the park a few weeks ago, full of pride and arrogance. This was someone else, someone who had finally understood what it meant to truly serve. That's the first step, I said quietly. But you need to remember something. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, a choice you make every day. You have to be willing to keep moving forward, even when it's hard. He met my gaze, his expression resolute. I know, and I'm ready for it. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from knowing that someone has learned something valuable, even if they're still in the early stages of the journey. Good, I said simply. Just remember, the most important thing is to never forget why you're doing this. The people you serve, they matter. They're not just names on a report or faces in the crowd. They're real, and they deserve more than just a cop doing his job. They deserve someone who listens, who cares. Officer Williams sat quietly for a moment, his eyes far away, as if taking in everything I had said. I'll do better, he finally said, his voice steady. I won't forget. We sat there for a while longer, the silence between us comfortable, but filled with a kind of understanding that hadn't existed before. The world outside of this moment seemed to fade away, as if this small conversation had been the most important thing in that moment. I didn't need to say anything else. He knew what was at stake. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But the difference now was that he was no longer walking it alone. He was ready to do the work, to be better, and that was all I could ask for. As I watched him stand up and walk away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. He was still a long way from perfect, but he had taken the first real step. And that was enough for now. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to be this sure of someone. Officer Williams had come a long way, and today, I watched him again, walking with the same steady determination I had seen in him just weeks ago. The transformation in him was undeniable. It wasn't just in the way he carried himself. It was in the way he moved through the world now, noticing the people around him, taking time to listen. I'd seen him try before, but now, it was different. There was something more genuine in his actions. His steps were more purposeful, the kind of movements you only see in someone who knows exactly who they are. I sat in the park, once again on my usual bench, watching him approach, the soft murmur of the breeze rustling through the trees. He smiled when he saw me, that same respectful smile he had shown in our last meeting. It was clear, by now, that he was committed to this change he had started. Eleanor. He greeted me warmly as he approached, his voice easy but sincere. I hope I'm not interrupting. I shook my head, gesturing for him to sit down. Not at all, I replied, offering him a seat beside me. How have you been? He exhaled slowly, sitting down next to me with a thoughtful look. I've been trying. I mean, really trying. But it's harder than I thought. His words were not filled with defeat, but with the quiet reality of change. I know it won't happen overnight, but every day, I try to be better. I studied him for a moment. This was the officer I had seen grow in front of my eyes. The shift in him wasn't just about listening to others. It was about actively changing his perspective and his actions. It was rare for anyone to take such responsibility for their own growth, and I admired that in him. You're doing good, I said, my voice calm but firm. It's the small steps that matter. The day-to-day choices. It's not about being perfect. It's about being consistent. I think I'm starting to get that, he said, looking out at the park around us. I've been going to meetings, trying to be involved in the community more. Not just because it's my job, but because it's the right thing to do. I've started talking to people, not as a cop, but as someone who genuinely wants to understand their lives. I nodded. That was the difference. He wasn't just doing his job anymore. He was becoming a part of the world he served, connecting with it in a way that he hadn't before. And what have you learned? I asked, curious. He smiled slightly, his eyes focused on the ground. I've learned that people just want to be heard. That's the first thing. They don't need someone to fix their problems or tell them what to do. They need someone to listen, to see them. And I've also learned that it's not enough to just show up. You have to show up with empathy. You have to be present. And that's not easy, I replied. It's easy to get lost in the system, to forget the humanity behind the badge, but you've made the right choice. You're choosing to see people. It feels different, he said softly. For the first time, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. It's not about issuing tickets or enforcing laws. It's about making a connection, helping people without them feeling like they're just another case to close. He turned to me, his gaze steady. I'm not there yet, but I'm getting there. I gave him a small smile. That's all anyone can do. Keep getting there. It's the journey that counts, not the destination. We both sat there in silence for a moment, the sounds of the park around us filling the space between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that came with understanding. Finally, he stood up, looking down at me with a sense of quiet determination. "I think I can do this," he said, his voice steady, without hesitation. "I want to be someone who really makes a difference. I want to be someone they can trust." I watched him walk away, his steps confident but thoughtful. He wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But in that moment, we both understood that change wasn't a one-time event. It was something you chose every day, and Officer Williams was making that choice. The world around us continued to move, the noise of life still going on, but for me, there was a peace in knowing that someone had learned the true meaning of service. It wasn't about authority. It was about compassion. And in that quiet moment, I knew he would make a difference.